Hello, and this is my show. I am here today to talk about linting. Linting all the things. I know it's exciting, but we're going to do it anyway. So, welcome to my show. My name is Bret. This is the internet. You're watching me hopefully live. If not, I'm here every Thursday, and you get to come and ask questions. Sometimes we have topics. Sometimes I have guests. Sometimes it's just Q&A, and we talk about everything, containers, DevOps, and any questions you have for me. So, thanks for showing up. We are going to dive in a little deep on something called Super-Linter, which I have been implementing everywhere all year long. It's a GitHub project. We'll get into it. We are going to demo something that I didn't even know was in beta yet until today. So what I had planned for today was talk about all the things in GitHub that are coming for us to all reuse and template each other's workflows. Because as I adopt more GitHub Actions in my own work, I'm more convinced that it is the default automation platform. I'm not even going to call it CI. It's just an automation platform that can do CI, CD, and a bunch of other things, all inside your repos where your code is already existing. Now, it doesn't mean I don't like GitLab or Bitbucket or everything else out there for storing code and CI, but I think the future of automation platforms is that they are going to be built into our code repo systems. So, oh, look at that. I got a little bit of a monitor in there. All right. Adjusted my camera setup today, so things are not perfect. All right, so first off, let's get to some questions. Hello, everyone in chat. I've got lots to talk about and demos and repos that I want to show off. But first, let's chat. Hello, everyone. Saeem's in from the Cloud Native FM. Hello, Paul, Martin, Owen. Hello, everyone. Is the hard J Jobin or is it Jobin? Not sure how to pronounce that. Sorry if I mispronounced it. Hello. So hyped for this, Philip. Been looking to add a linter for my repos at work. Fantastic. Rishab, 1,000 problems and one solution. As we will talk about, linting creates its own problems, but I'm convinced that it's better than not having it, right? Especially when you have a team. And quite frankly, I learned stuff about my own writing skills or lack of by using linters. So a lot of times I don't realize that maybe the thing I learned a decade ago, like JavaScript, that has evolved. We have changed the way we prefer to write JavaScript, for example. So linters, I think, help keep me up to date on the latest opinions on ways to write things. So I think it's overall a good thing. It is work. Linting is work, but it's necessary work. And I think there's a ton of, especially if you're in a larger team, the bigger your team grows, the more important and more reasons you need linting. So we'll talk about that. All right. So hello, everyone. Conrad. Where should one add things like a linter within a multi-stage Docker file? So no, you could put linting in a Docker file and add that as a stage for linting that you do with testing. But I suspect that your CI platform or your automation platform of choice is going to be a better place to do that in that language. One of the advantages, I guess, of putting in a Docker file is it will run anywhere you can run Docker, right? So you can lint everywhere. But a lot of times locally nowadays, things are evolving where linting is a part of our editors, assuming you've got your editor set up for that. Linting is something, as we'll see with GitHub Actions, that is really best to run in parallel beside your building of your image. And this goes into the whole CI testing too, right? Because that question you're asking, Conrad, is a great one. You can put all your testing in a Docker file, and then just basically your CI is building a Docker file. And then it does all the testing, it does all the linting, all while building in Docker. You could do that, and that's very transportable. But I think what you end up with is you lose a lot of the platform functionality that you would get from an automation tool, CI tool, whatever, Jenkins, you name them all. They don't really bring forward the Docker file experience as a first-class citizen in those tools. So for example, if you do a Docker build, in just every tool I've ever seen, like a CI tool or automation tool, it's going to kind of treat that as one step, one action, one workflow piece, and it either passes or fails. And then you have to dig into the logging to see all that stuff. Whereas if you bring the linting out of that and the CI testing out of that, and you put it in the native tool of your automation tool, then you get to see the logs are split out to each step. You can see the progress of the steps. You can have different things happen depending on which step fails. You can do all that logic in your CI. Otherwise, you're forced to do it all in your Docker file. Now, if we were in a different 2021 and the world had accepted Docker file as sort of the standard for all things CI and automation, then I think those tools would, they would create stages better. They would highlight stages as different steps in your workflow, but nobody's doing that yet. And I wish they would. But today we're still using YAML instead of Dockerfile. And the way that GitHub Actions works, and a lot of the other tools that it's designed on and that are also following suit now, I feel like YAML's a better place for a lot of that. Like the Dockerfile is inherently limited to basically turning into a bash script, right? Like, I mean, if you're going to be doing all this in a Linux shell, you're just bashing it out. And that's what GitHub Actions separates from me. It prevents me from having to write shell scripts for every single automation I want to do. And that's the future of automation, is not being a bash expert like you might have to be with much more basic tools like maybe Drone or Jenkins, where you would have to bash a lot of things. These new tools, it's all about sharing workflows, sharing reusable components, right? And Super-Linter is part of that. So anyway, that's kind of my opinion. I went down a rabbit hole there, Conrad, but that's a great question. Am I planning to make a video on traffic? This channel has had multiple discussions around traffic. I've had a guest on this show about traffic, and a friend of mine actually makes courses on traffic. So I don't have any traffic plans in the near term, like meaning this year. If you go in this channel and you just on YouTube and you just search in the videos, if you just search for traffic, you will find previous videos that we talk about traffic and some guests that are even smarter at traffic than myself, because I don't really consider myself a traffic expert. I am a traffic ambassador, so I love to talk about it. But no, I don't plan on having a video. So. All right. Can we efficiently use Linter? Absolutely. And security scanning to the automation, GitLab CI is also a similar path. Yes. So all these are great questions. Yes, the whole point is we want to lint every time there's a commit. I'm convinced now that linting, at least in GitHub with Super-Linter, is so easy to implement that it's eventually at some point going to just be a checkbox. There's devils in the details if you have really large mono repos that are existing and you're basically bringing in and linting an existing code base for the first time. If you're doing that, there is work. You're going to have to tune your linter. But just the act of linting is what I'm talking about here, not the perfection of your linting, because that is an evolving process where you might want to disable rules. I disable rules. When I lint my Docker files, there's some rules I disable. When I do shell script linting, I sometimes have to put in exceptions. So that's all the effort of implementing linting. But really what we want to do is get started by saying linting is in my repos. All of my repos lint by default. Every time you push a commit, they lint. Every time you push a commit, they lint. Does that rhyme? Almost rhymes. That's what we're going to do. And I'm going to get into it. So let me get through these questions real quick. Security scanning we could totally do that as a part of this. I will show an example repo that I plan to put in a security scanner. But the short answer is security scanning is happening automatically in a lot of places now. On GitHub, it's automatically scanning with Dependabot all your app dependencies. It's not scanning images, but it is scanning your app dependencies. So if you enable that by default, and I have it enabled on all my repos, then you're already getting, I'd say 80% of the scanning stuff that you get out of a image scanner. An image scanner will scan apt-get dependencies and yum dependencies, but those you won't get out of a Dependabot scanner. But a lot of our image storage, like Key or Harbor, or if you pay for Docker Hub, a lot of these, they auto scan your images now already. So I'm finding that CVE scanners for images, or just in general for a repo, is not a workflow that I'm running out of the box. Like, I don't automatically gravitate to that because I've already got so many other places where that's happening. If you do need to, Trivy and Snyk are my two favorites. So look up Trivy and Snyk, Trivy and Snyk. But we're not going to get into that today. We're doing linting. And on GitLab, I didn't get a chance to actually make this demo work on GitLab, but that is definitely a thing. I will talk about how to just run Super-Linter anywhere without the GitHub Action. So Paul, I would say linting is a great question of why do it in CI versus do it locally. So absolutely, you should do it locally, but you can't be sure that other developers are doing it locally, right? How do you know that they did it? So I believe that linting, as well as just any other code analysis tool that you're using in your IDE, I hate it when teams enforce an IDE on their developers. So I never recommend that. Let the developer implement their own, use their own editor. And so I think a lot of this stuff I would recommend pushing to your automation platform first, your code storage platform first, because that's where their code meets the rest of the code, right? And that's where you should do all the automated testing. That's where you should do the linting and the security scanning. Like, all that happens there. Someone may have done that locally, but you can't be certain of that. And you don't know if their linter's the exact same version. So you do you locally. If you want to lint before you push, great. It'll probably save you some pushes. I know for me, when I'm lazy a lot of the times, I won't run the linting locally. I just push to my PR branch, and then I'll fail, just like I did today in this demo. I failed a lint. So I fixed a lint, pushed another commit to my PR, and when my PR is done and I'm ready to get the code merged, I will squash and merge anyway, so my extra commits don't matter. But you could argue that you would save time by doing it locally, but I don't. I don't have Super-Linter automated locally. That's maybe a next step that I could do, but a lot of the tools nowadays, especially in things like VS Code, which not everyone's using, but in VS Code, a lot of those linters, part of the rule set of them are already implemented in a lot of the extensions you use. So, mine's going to warn me about bad markdown automatically. So it's technically linting as a part of the markdown defaults and stuff like that. Maybe I have a markdown extension that I'm not aware of, because we've all got lots of VS Code extensions. But the way you make it a gate that people have to step through of making sure they're linted, is to put it in your code repos in your automation platform. But that's a great question. Yeah. So there are certainly stages to implementing linting, right? And Super-Linter is no different than any other linter. Super-Linter is like the meta linter. It basically collects a whole bunch of linters from open source, dozens of them, and makes a shell script in a Docker image that will auto-run it on your entire repo, and then finds all the files for each linter and gives it to that linter. So it just saves you a lot of time of implementing every single file type linter. The first time you implement linting for your team, you will probably not want it to fail your PRs, right? You're going to want it in sort of a review mode where you see the failures, but it's not going to prevent, image building, testing of your code, all that other stuff, right? You want sort of kind of like with testing, when you're first building your testing platform, you want to kind of tiptoe into it. So you probably don't want the first day that you're automating your testing of your apps, you probably don't want that to fail PRs and prevent them from merging. You want to sort of let that bake a little bit, make sure that it's working well before you turn it into you can't merge this until you fix the lints. Because as I just experienced today, there are problems with my linters because I'm using a brand new GitHub feature that the particular linter that I'm using for GitHub Actions doesn't have in it. So my lints fail, but it's not my fault. Anyway, those are the kind of things that can get in your way with linting. So I don't tend to enforce linting unless I have a very mature team that has been linting since day one, and they have opinions about their linting, and they know all the different exceptions to their lints and stuff like that. All great questions. Which is my favorite lint style guide? I do not have one. Half of them does not on our team. Yeah, I don't. The style guide would be very specific to a language, and the whole point today is talk about Super-Linter, which scans dozens of languages. So your Markdown, your GitHub Action files, your Kubernetes files, your Docker files, it even, all your coded stuff, your text files, even it looks for copy paste, making sure that you don't have repetitive anything anywhere in any file. There's just so much to it. So let's jump in. And we'll talk through it as we go. By the way, thank you to all you patrons. We continue to get a few more patrons every month, and I really appreciate that. If you remember, you don't have to pay. You just go to patreon.com/Bret Fisher, and you can click on the follow button, and you get my weekly updates on my open source, my guests, all the things I'm doing. And if you would like to join my gratitude or the High Fivers Club, you get exclusive benefits for that in our Discord channel as well. And one of the nice things around the High Fivers Club is we do a monthly call. One of the things we're going to start doing in our monthly calls are, I'm going to ask maybe a week ahead of time for people to submit files for review, not code files, but more DevOps files. So infrastructure, Docker files, manifests, Helm charts, Terraforms, whatever. You're going to submit those as a part of the High Fivers Club, and then I will review one or two during the call. So we're going to have a call every month. We've been having that for a while now. It's kind of a coffee chat. We just hang out, talk about our projects, what we're all working on in DevOps. And now we're going to start reviewing or critiquing each other's stuff and seeing if we can't all learn from each other and make our stuff better at the same time. So that call is happening in October. We had the one for September already, so please sign up here if you're interested in that. Again, we're going to do that once a month on Patreon. Thank you to my patrons. You make this show possible. All right, Super-Linter. Super-Linter is an official GitHub project that is essentially a shell script. It's just a shell script, but what it does is it has a Docker image that combines dozens of linters from every other language on the internet. And by language, like I mentioned, all those files, right? All those file types. And so it is implemented as a GitHub action, but you don't have to use it as an action. You can use it as a regular Docker container. You can run it locally in a Docker container against your code or your repo or anything you're doing. If you just had a big bunch of Markdown, you just wanted to make sure it was properly marked down, you could do that. And you could run this on that even without a repo. So you can see there's this huge list here, and it includes infrastructure, it includes languages, programming languages. It includes things like SQL that you wouldn't actually consider a language, maybe. It is a language, but you wouldn't think of it as a programming language that you would normally specifically lint. And so that's the advantage of this, is by implementing this one time, you're going to probably capture all those types of files that you maybe traditionally wouldn't bother with linting, right? Because they're just, maybe you only have a few SQL files and they're just in a seeding directory for your developers to seed their local setups. But here it's just built in, and they're adding more all the time. In fact, they just added secret scanning, which is fantastic. I'm so glad they're getting into this world, because for right now, they don't have anything that I'm aware of in here that's very specifically security related, but Git leaks will scan your repo for different types of keys, and it recognizes the formats of different keys. Like, it knows what a GitHub personal access token looks like. It knows other types of keys and secrets, AWS stuff, and it will automatically warn you. This is the kind of thing you really want running locally before you commit it, but at least it will scan and find those on commit when you push it, and then you can basically disable that key that you've kind of exposed now and go make a new key, because once you've pushed it to GitHub, it's exposed. Like there's there's a lot of work involved if you want to try to actually permanently remove that after you've pushed it. So it's great that they're adding that in there. That was the latest one they just added, I think, last week. But you can see that there's so much in here. One of the challenges you're going to have is that some of these, they don't try to make a preference. So for example, in JavaScript, you can use ESLint or standard JS. Those are two comparable linters for JavaScript that kind of do the same thing. Of course, no two linters, because a lot of this is opinion, no two linters really work exactly the same way. So you will at times find that you want to disable one or the other and just pick your preference, because you might find that you don't need two JavaScript linters, you really just need one. That's also true of Docker files. We'll see in my example here in a minute that I actually disable the Docker file lint. I find it to be outdated and full of more issues, even though it has some rules that Lint does not have. I just choose to disable it just because I feel like Lint is enough. There's actually another one out there that's a security-based linter that I wish they would add, maybe a PR someday. So they're a really responsive team. I've already made at least, I think, one PR to them. Pretty responsive. So a good team, again, run by GitHub internally, but lots and lots of contributors. If you go up here, you can see that there are no shortage of contributors on this project, 150. And they just released 2 days ago, the 4.8, which is what I think added the Git leaks security scanner. But the way you implement this tool is like any other GitHub action. They have a sample, and once we get past all the configuration, you see that you would just create a workflow, and the meat of this is really just right here. You basically just call this action, and you give it your GitHub token and tell it what your default branch is, and that way it does a comparison. So the way this thing is designed to work out of the box, especially because this is set right here, when you're doing a PR, it only lints your changes, which is super important, because you probably, especially if you have a large repo, and especially if you haven't been linting all the things all the time, you're going to have tons of errors starting out because you haven't been linting. So with PRs, it will only scan the files that you change in your PR, so that your work for fixing your lints is a lot less. I'm going to go into the example of how I've tweaked that and made it even better, at least in my opinion. And one of the other things you're going to need to do when you implement this is they have lots of environment variables for customizing it. So you can turn on and off each linter at your discretion. Each linter is also going to have configuration files, of which they have default templates that you can copy into your own directory and customize them and make it your own, and so on. And then, if you, like I said, if you decide if you don't want a particular linter, you can disable it. So a lot of these, you'll see when we get down here, validate, all these ones that are validate. So that basically means turn on or off this linter. And it runs all linters by default, and it runs that linter specifically on the files for that particular linter. So the file names matter. And I think out of the box, it does just work. Of course, like anything, there's devils in the details. But to start out, it's pretty simple to get started. What I've done, and I'll put this in chat, is I have created a Super-Linter example. It's a template repo that you can reuse on your own. When you want to create new repos, you can make this your default. But I've found that there's a better way you can use something like this, and that's known as Reusable Workflows, a brand new beta feature in GitHub Actions that allows you to point to some other workflow file anywhere in GitHub and reuse that entire workflow with a one-liner. So we're going to do that today as we implement this tool. And that's my dream, right? Is in an organization, I have a single repo that I put this or many workflow templates in that are basically the same thing. A linter, you could argue, could be very configured to work in all your repos by default. and you have this in one repo, and then every other repo just calls this linter and runs the same workflow. So that's a beta feature, and I just started using it 30 minutes ago, and it did work. I'm pretty excited, so we're going to try it out. Let's just look at what I've done. So this is going to be the repo, by the way, going forward for talking all about Super-Linter and documenting my examples. I've got more README stuff to put into here. So I'm going to have more documentation eventually. But those are the main things I'm looking for right now, is that basically we're going to be using the Super-Linter in a GitHub Action, but I've added a few things to it. One of them is I don't assume you have just one release branch, and I don't assume that we know the name of your default branch. And so I had a little bash script in there essentially that it's going to correctly determine one or more of your release branches, because if you make fancy software and you maybe have versioned branches that you release from, then you can't just have one main branch, right? Simple apps and sort of GitHub Flow apps, they do have a main branch or a master branch, and then everything is shipped from that branch. So it works out of the box with that. But if you're in a more advanced scenario, like I believe that some of us are, where you need to technically PR to many different branches at different times, not just all PRs go to the main branch, then you're going to want this GitHub logic that I've added. And then I've changed this up a little bit based on an opinion of a friend of mine that linting in a PR should only be linting the changed files. That's great. But when you lint on a release branch, let's say main, when you lint on that branch after you've merged, you want to lint everything because you kind of want to know the state of the world of what you're releasing, right? Especially if you've got old code. If you're bringing this to existing code, you're probably going to have lots of linting errors. So you kind of want, as a sort of a report of the state of my repo in linting, you want at some point to lint everything all at once. And so I've changed this to essentially on PR only lint changes, on commit to a main branch or one of your release branches, lint everything. So that's the other change I make. Now, this isn't necessarily GitHub Action specific. Again, I was saying that. So one of the things in Super-Linter that I'll be adding to the documentation is if you look in their documentation, by the way, I should put the Super-Linter in the chat. If you just want to run this locally, yeah, there we go. So running it locally, it's essentially a Docker run command. So they have a document, and this is kind of what you're going to run. So you just need to set a couple environment variables. You can set the run local true. That's what you want to do so that it doesn't try to go check for GitHub Action stuff, because it's no longer running GitHub Actions. Then you want to mount in your code base to a specific location, and then you're going to run their image from Docker Hub. I honestly found that running it against a single file doesn't work the way that I expect. So I need to put in a bug report or something, because it doesn't work against a single file. However, if you want to run only one of the linters instead of all the linters, you would just set validate. Let's say you want to lint Docker files. So you would put in here the environment variable -e validate _ Docker file equals true. When you do that, it goes from running every linter to running only that linter. So it's intelligent enough to say, hey, if you're not specifically enabling any linters in my environment variables, then I assume you want to run them all. If you set any of them to false, it will run all the others. If you set any of them to true, it automatically falses all the others. So it's a pretty interesting logic out of the box. I find it very easy and friendly to use locally. Warning though, this image is big. It's somewhere between 1 and 2 gig. I think it might be closer to 2 gig in size. They have a slim option that removes something like, I think it removes Java and .NET and some other stuff, but it's still pretty big. We're still talking about 1 gig to 2 gig in size. So just realize that. All right. Any questions so far? Saeed, sorry, we're talking about linting today, so that's a great question you have for the DevOps chat. So if you go into Discord and you find the best channel for that, see if anyone there can help you with that. Yeah, and I don't use Spring Boot, so that's not going to be a great question for me. But again, we have DevOps chat there. You can maybe get some smart people, because we have tons of smart people that hang out in the Discord, and you can get help there. Can I set this up as a Docker image to lint via the Jenkins pipeline? Yes, you would simply use that. Now, there might be a Super-Linter Jenkins extension or plugin. I haven't looked, but assuming that is not, you would simply have something inside of your Jenkins that would essentially run this command. It would just need to run a Docker image as a part of your pipeline in Jenkins. All right? Great question. Okay, so getting into the example here. So the way, in case you're real quick on GitHub Actions, they all go in GitHub, in the GitHub subdirectory, the .github underneath the workflows. And I just created this one called Super-Linter. Now, this is using their template. And all of this is kind of default. We're going to talk about this brand new feature called Workflow Call in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to ignore that. And we're basically saying, I release everything on this particular example. I'm releasing everything from the main branch, all pull requests. I'm basically going to lint on any pull request or any commit to the main branch. So if you have other branches that are not PRs, it will not lint. Okay? This is an opinion. I'm not saying my opinion is right. You may decide you want to lint on every push to every branch and every pull request. So great. The one challenge there, if you've ever worked with GitHub Actions, is if you just say push and pull request without anything else inside them, on pull request, it will technically it will lint twice because it'll lint because the event push happened, and then it'll lint a second time because there's a pull request for that commit. So you kind of got to play with these events to make sure that you're not linting too much or linting too little. Permissions in here, this is not by default, but these are the minimum permissions you need in order to run this. I am a fan of secure by default. So if you didn't know, with GitHub Actions, any workflow by default gets read-write everything in the repo. I prefer to lock them down and give them only the permissions that they need. And this has to do with the GitHub token, which we're not going to really get into today. But the GitHub token is what the runner, the thing that runs all of this stuff for you, whether it's a GitHub runner or your private runner, those things get a token, which is simply it's a temporary password to GitHub. And so that prevents you from having to create pats and other permanent keys to do things like clone the repo. So GitHub tokens are temporary and permissions are restricted. And I'm setting the permissions here to basically say you only get read access to the repo contents, and you can only write to the status and checks. So if you've heard of checks, checks are things that show up in your PRs and in your code. We'll see them in a minute. Those are the little green checkboxes that you see when automation runs. And so we want to write custom ones, so we kind of need to use the API for that. All right. Down here, we're checking out the code. You got to do that first. And then we're going to run the linter. Now, this little piece of ugly bash that I made is not essential, but this is for people who don't have a set default branch. So if you tend to change your default branch based on which release you're using, or if you have many branches that you release from because maybe you're making commercial software that's downloaded or something like that, and you have version 5.2 and version 5.3, and you might be releasing in multiple places, you will need this type of logic, because one of the things that the Super-Linter does, in case you want to follow along, by the way, I'll put this next link in chat. One of the things this linter does is it will, on a PR, it will compare that PR to the branch it's PRing, if that's a thing, the pull request target, as we call it, but it assumes that branch is the same branch and you're PRing to the same branch all the time. I find in most complex repos, that's just not true. I might be PRing to your PR branch because I saw something in your PR that needs fixed and I thought to help with it. So, there's all sorts of scenarios where we're going to be using a PR or a diff against something other than our default branch. So what I've created is that git logic, or that bash logic rather, this bash logic up top will determine at runtime which is the target branch I'm trying to PR to if this is a PR. All right? And then it'll throw that environment variable in here. That way you always get the proper linting of only the changed files. And this is the other bonus I add in here, is that by default, this is set to false in their template. But sometimes you may want to validate all your code base. And in my new opinion, I do that when it's not a pull request. On a pull request, I only really want to edit or lint the changes. But on any other of the other branches that this is firing for, any of the events that are up the top, right? So any of these in this list, what I wanted to do is lint everything. So GitHub Actions has logic that allows me to put in an expression here that will change based on whether this is a pull request or not. So I'm basically saying, if it's a pull request, make this false. If it's not a pull request, make it true. Now, these are some opinions I've thrown in. These are just my opinions, but experience, especially in DevOps, of using linting in DevOps has taught me a few things about these linters. It has taught me that in DevOps, you often have repetitive YAML, and so I want to turn off copy-paste detection because I'm not really so worried about repetitive code that I don't want it to lint and alert me that it sees the same 10 lines in a YAML file twice, for example. I also talked earlier about disabling duplicate linters because Super-Linter tries to be unopinionated. So when there is a bunch of linters for the same file type, it eventually, based on community contributions, it will have multiple options and they're all enabled. So you get to choose your preference. And I've chosen the Hadoop lint, Dockerfile linter, and I've disabled the other one. And then down here, if you're familiar with editor config is a great way to make a standard editor configuration for anyone's editor that supports the editor config standard. So this is a pretty neat thing. If you're in a team, you might have someone using Vim, you might have someone else using VS Code, someone might be using a special Ruby app, someone might be using Atom or Emacs, whatever. And all of those you can implement editor config into, which takes a single file known as the .editor config, and it allows you to conform and standardize on things like tabs versus spaces, how many spaces for each tab. Do you want a new line at the end of the file? Do you want to allow extra spaces at the end of a line? Do you want max line length? All those type of basic editor things. And the cool thing is, if you implement editor config, this isn't specifically a linter thing, but if you implement editor config in a team, everyone can choose their tools, and their tools should all respond and warn to them when they're editing wrong before you push code and find that someone else using Vim, it didn't warn them about tabs versus spaces in Python or something. And so you want to implement this eventually in a large team. And here in my example, there is a thing called editor config checker, which is an interesting idea in practice. What it does is, based on what your editor config is set up for, it will lint everything in your repo based on that config. However, I find it to be a pretty brute force tool for linting, and it's not near as intelligent or as granular as all the other linters. So since we're using Super-Linter, and Super-Linter picks the right linter for the job, I don't want editor config linting of my entire repo. Weirdly, you would think that this lints the editor config file, but it doesn't. It actually lints the entire repo. So I disable that. And then if you're a Kubernetes person and you're using custom resource definitions, which you almost certainly are, the kube-eval or kube-val, that particular linter will error out by default because it doesn't know what type of resource that is because it doesn't come by default with Kubernetes. So I set in some options for it to not warn for that. Now, again, for all these linters, you can set custom config files in here and all that stuff. But that's the linting file. That's it. The other thing that is going to complement this for you in GitHub Actions is to do a few more things. One of those is Dependabot. Dependabot is great. It does many things. You can see it over here under security in your repo. It is not a linting specific thing. I just want to mention it here because once you start using GitHub Actions, these versions of things, so when you're in these files, right, this is a version of this action. And I always recommend you pin to versions on everything, really, especially if you're talking about a real world business with production stuff. You want to pin stuff. So I pin the version of any of my action steps, right? So down here, I pinned the Super-Linter. And then Dependabot is a generic dependency checker. So most people know Dependabot because it will, in the security tab, it will tell you that your npm package JSON is out of date, or your Ruby gem file is out of date, or your Python pip stuff is out of date, right? It'll tell you for each language things that are security related out of date. You can even customize all those per ecosystem in this file. So this isn't, dismiss that alert. I don't know what that's about. But what I'm doing here is I'm enabling it and saying specifically, I would like you to check for updated versions in the GitHub Actions package ecosystem. And every month, it will give me PRs in my repo to update the versions of my GitHub Action steps. Pretty cool, right? So whenever a new linter version comes out, about once a month, I will see a PR show up from a robot that tells me to it basically updates that one line and it just changes the version. And it also does, linting because I've got the linter enabled. It will do linting on that PR. And every month I kind of, go through all my repos and say yes, yes, yes to all the Dependabot PRs. So you want this file in here to help you automate that and keep your stuff fresh, not stale. The other thing you're going to want to do, which is not here, but as you add linters, I'm going to add an example. If you look up the Super-Linter, it basically says any custom files go in a subdirectory of GitHub called linters. You can see that in action. Oh, no, you can't. I thought you could. I don't have an example here, but essentially what you're going to do is you're going to have a directory here called linters, and in there, for every single linter that you want to customize, you will implement its specific file, right? Because every linter is different, and you can see all that in the Super-Linter documentation. If we just go back to the main repo, and you go down to using your own rule files, it will basically explain to you, yep, make that directory, and then you're going to put the file type for that particular linter. And if you look at their repo, I can show you that they have a template file for every major, I'm not sure if I'm going to say all the linters, but all the major ones that they have in here. So if you go under templates in the Super-Linter repo, you will see templates for everything from Ansible to JavaScript to Dockerfile, everything, right? And each one of them is going to be completely unique. You don't have to put these in by default, but you likely will eventually need it. So, for example, on the Markdown linter, I tend to put in a rule that says, I don't care how long my lines are. If someone wants to write a 800 character line, fine. Maybe I'll limit it to 4,000 characters per line. But by default in Markdown linter, it will complain after 80 characters. I want way more than that. I think it's 80 characters, but I want it to have at least 400, 800 characters, I don't really care because all modern editors have word wrap and I just word wrap. So anyway, that's just me. That's something that I would do in a custom file. I would call it markdown lint and I would add it to that linters directory inside my repo. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, you weren't kidding about the size. The non-slim version is 5.2 gig when pulled to my machine, unless they make you pick and choose which linters you need. This isn't practical in a pipeline workflow. I would argue that it is practical because it's downloading it once, right? So it's not going to update it until you change the version. And so it's going to download it one time. I mean, every CI system I know has tons of disk space because it's downloading dozens of images, right? I am using this in corporate projects in multiple places on dozens of GitHub runners, and it works fine. It takes about 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the machine, to download on a server in the cloud. It's definitely going to be longer locally. So if you want to use the Slim, just use, they show you how to use Slim in here. So if you don't use rust.env linters, ARM, I guess that's ARM development or something, PowerShell or C#, if you don't use those, it shrinks it down. It brings it down 2 gig. So it saves you 2 gig on the download. But the reality is that what I see in the real world is when you enable this in a repo or in your CI, you're linting on every commit. It's downloading this once every few weeks, and then it's storing that 5 gig image and running it in every single pipeline, right? It's constantly running. As people are committing and pushing to branches and PRs, it's linting and linting. So I don't feel like that's a big deal, especially considering that most applications I work with, it's a Node app, it's a PHP app, it's a Ruby app. Those are 1 to 2 gig themselves, and those fill up the hard drives way faster than a linter. Because if you've ever done CI on those types of images, when you build those images, it's a brand new image layer. A bunch of the layers are all new every single time you build. And if you have a team of people, let's say you're building 20, 30 times a day, that's a new, probably 500 meg of dependencies and stuff every day, depending on how you design your Docker file. So every single CI system I've managed, you have to have daily image cleanup, which is a whole separate topic for a different day. But you should definitely have some sort of Dockerfile image cleanup where it prunes the images that aren't in use every single day, that haven't been used. I think there's actually a setting that will, in the prune command, the Docker prune command, that will prevent from removing any images that are less than 3 days old, essentially. So you can tell it basically if I've made stuff today or yesterday, don't delete it. But I do that on all of my GitHub runners and other CI platforms. They all auto clean anyway. So that's what I recommend. But that's a great comment that it is heavy, but I find that the benefits outweigh the negatives. But that's just me. Can you customize a Super-Linter image? No. If you mean, can I customize the linters? Yes, every single linter can be customized, like we just showed. Can you add new linters? No. What I would recommend you then do is do a PR to the Super-Linter, because the Super-Linter repo is very accepting of PRs of new linters. If you needed to run a one-off linter, or if you don't like their version of the linter, let's say maybe you need to use an older version of a linter that they have updated. I would argue that if they're running an outdated version of the linter, just give them a PR to update that version of the linter, and they'll do it. I see them do this every week. They're constantly updating it. But if you need your own, then what I would recommend inside your own workflow file, you could either make a separate workflow just for that linter, or what I do is I just add a step at the very bottom. So let's say I wanted to run a custom version of a Golang linter. What I would do here is I would add a new line that says validate Go false, So it would not run the Go linter here. And then I would add one more step that would run the Golang linter. And when it's GitHub Actions, let's just do marketplace actions. So if I go to the GitHub marketplace for actions and do, I think it's called Golang CI. So this is the linter for Go that Super-Linter uses, and that project has its own GitHub action to just run it. So if I wanted to specify a very particular version of this linter, I could just add this action step. You know, they give an example here where that's all I need is that right there. So I would just add that as another step underneath Super-Linter. So the goal of Super-Linter isn't to be the perfect linter for every repo and every code file. That's my opinion. I don't think that it's going to achieve in a very large team. We're talking dozens of developers all on a single repo. I don't think it's easy for you to achieve perfection in exactly everything with Super-Linter. What I'm arguing for and what I'm advocating for here is that you start with Super-Linter. Super-Linter should be the thing that's in every repo by default, running on at least every PR and possibly every commit. That's your base. You start there. And then over time, as you mature, you might find that for Ruby, you prefer a different version of Rubocop. So you disable that linter in Super-Linter and you run it as a second step after Super-Linter. And eventually you'll end up with your own custom setup that's highly tweaked to your environment. But I feel like Super-Linter gets you so close that it's a great starting point. If I could tell you, out of 7 years, the last 7 years of DevOps and development focused consulting, because if I go back farther than that, we're not even using containers back then, and obviously GitHub Actions and other modern CI tools weren't around. But for the last 7 years, really only I can think of one client that I've had out of dozens that lints every repo by default. Like, people just don't do it. And eventually that creates bad habits where you get different design opinions based on who committed. You get different styles because over time people leave the team and leave the company. New people show up with new opinions, and there's nothing to enforce opinions or style. And so it becomes harder and harder over time to edit other people's code, because the ultimate question becomes, do you implement your style and rewrite that file to your expectations? Or do you adhere to the previous author's opinions on that file? And that's a big question for teams. And linting takes the responsibility or the opinion away from people and just says, hey, it's the linter's opinion. If you don't like the linter's opinion, you can customize it. But at least it's standard for the whole team. And then everyone expects you to adhere to the standard instead of Bret's opinion or Joe's opinion or Mary's opinion, right? I hate to get into the opinion wars with dev teams because we all have our own expertise. So let the linter be the opinion, and you all customize the linter the way you need to and move forward, right? So I'm convinced that with something like this, when you have dozens of files now in a repo, file types, if you think about it, just in a JavaScript repo for a website, you're going to have JavaScript, CSS, HTML, probably YAML, JSON, probably a Docker file. You probably have some other types of files that I'm not even thinking of. But just alone, that's like 6 different linters. And Super-Linter will get you started and probably tell you about linters that you didn't even know existed for particular file types that you didn't know you needed to lint. You're going to have a markdown file, so you need a markdown linter. Like, there's just so many things there, right? So I feel like it's the great beginning for everyone. So you tell me what you think in chat, and I'm going to give you an example now, before we wrap this up, of using my example here in your own repos without having to write the entire Super-Linter file for your own repos. One of the challenges is, let's say your organization has 50 repos. How do you standardize on the Super-Linter in every one of those repos without repeating the same workflow file over and over and over again. And if you've seen my example, there's some customization here, right? There's some customization there. So you might need to customize a little bit per repo, like individual configuration files or something like that per repo. So I haven't figured out the customization part yet because I just did this today. But there is a new thing. Let me bring that up. There's a new beta in GitHub Actions. You might already have this. If you're not using GitHub Actions, you're using another platform like Jenkins or GitLab or, whatever. You might have this. But GitHub is calling it Reusable Workflows. So let me pull that up. So for those of you that have repos on GitHub, check this out. Reusable workflows are a two-part system where you make the workflow in one repo, and then in all the other repos that you would like to use it, you call to that workflow in the separate repo by file path. And then you don't have to repeat it over and over and over again. You just focus on editing and customizing it in one place. It's fantastic. This is not templates, by the way. If you look into something called GitHub Templates, which is another way to do this, a template repository, you can create a .github repo, or really any repo. Like, for example, this is technically a template repo, and this is technically a template repo. See how it says use this template? So inside your settings, you can mark this as a repo template, not a workflow template, but a repo template. That's only good when you're making new repos, though. You can't really, if I have a GitHub action in here, you can't easily reuse that in an existing repo. So then there's a thing known as workflow templates. And workflow templates are reusable templates for your organization. It doesn't work on a personal account. But if you're in an organization, free or otherwise, you create a .github repository. And then in a specific directory, you add a workflow. And you add that workflow file plus a metadata file into a repo. It's not going to give me all the examples here. What am I looking for? I'm looking for a screenshot. Yeah, and then you create a JSON file to describe that workflow, like the version. Actually, I don't know if it does versions, but you give it a description, a name. You can choose the icon, and you do all of that. And then if it's in a .github repo for your organization, whenever anyone creates a new action, if you've ever been in a repo and you say actions, new workflow, what you will see is a bunch of the templates from your organization right here, okay? And that just allows you to copy, again, copy, not reference, but copy that workflow. That's still not ideal for this scenario because really what we're saying is we ideally would just want one Super-Linter config that all our repos would work for, right? And we don't have to, what if you need to make a change to Super-Linter, like the version? Do you really want to have to PR 50 different repos to update the version of Super-Linter for 50 different repos? So that's where reusable workflows comes in. So I'm going to walk you through a real quick example, and then I'm going to take questions. All right. The first thing we need to do is this. This is my template. I need to add this event. This event means that other workflows in this repo or other repos, assuming this repo is public, can call this repo, particularly this workflow, I guess. It's going to be able to execute this workflow remotely. So I have to add this in as an event. That's all I got to do in my template. I optionally here can add values, like basically environment variables, that other workflows that call this, those callers, as they call it, those are calling workflows. And this is the called workflow. So in this one, I can set up environment variables like maybe I need a secret, or maybe I need some special setting, or maybe I can customize which I can add in all the validate, to enable and disable different linters. I can add those all here, and then we can set that stuff up when we're calling this from a different place. So this is my repo where all my Super-Linter config exists. And then in this repo, as an example, I'm going to use that workflow. So I'm not using a template. I'm not copy pasting inside of my workflows in my linter. This is all I need. So all I'm doing is calling as a single job another workflow. And you can specify versions and stuff, but I'm basically just saying follow the main branch because that's my default branch. So I'm doing an easy mode here. But I just need to specify the path on github.com to that file. And as you will see, it actually worked on the first try right here. So it ran this. I got an error. And the reason I got an error is because that brand new feature of reusable workflows is not built into one of the linters. Wouldn't you know it? There's a linter for GitHub Actions. That is a really neat linter. It's really smart. It will tell me if my GitHub Actions are properly designed and whether or not some of the settings I have. It even goes into the deep settings of each workflow action. But unfortunately, it hasn't been updated for this beta feature. So it has an error. But it's pretty obvious. It says, error found in linter, unexpected for key uses for job section, expected one of these things. And it's basically saying on this line is weird. I don't know, this line doesn't make any sense to me. And that's because this hasn't existed before. We haven't been able to use a specific file in a workflow. We've always had to specify either a Docker image or another GitHub action that's been published in the GitHub Action Marketplace. So this is a new way to use a workflow, and it's just simply not updated in the linter. So now my job is either I disable that rule, I can do that, or I go to that linter and then submit a ticket saying, hey, could you update your linter to account for this new beta feature? All right. So we know it's working, and it ran it. It's a little meta. I ran the GitHub action on the GitHub action during the PR. So that's it. And I love this. So now in all of my other repos, what I'm going to do, because all of my GitHub repos now, not all of them, but most of them that I've been working on, all have the linter. But now I can delete all that. And under workflows in my linters for every one of those repos, I can just do this. Now, depending on their branches, I may change that. It might have to be master if it's an older repo or something, but I might have to change that part. But this part will be the same. And then on my Super-Linter, I can just change it here in my repo. Now, for you, this is what I recommend. If you're doing this in open source in an organization, because I'm not exactly sure. This does work in private repos, but I think only for enterprise cloud. I'm not really sure on private repos. There's some limitations about cross-repo permissions, so you have to read up on the documentation. But what I recommend for you, this is how you implement this. You can do this today. So you're going to use my template here. So you're going to fork, essentially, with this button. You're going to fork this repo into your own repo or organization or whatever. You'll customize the workflow, the Super-Linter the way you want it. You'll customize all the settings down at the bottom. And then in all your other repos, you can just call that workflow. I probably wouldn't recommend you use mine just because mine is an example, and I don't want to change my example and break your repos. I don't want your linting to fail because my example is not what you want. So I recommend you first template or fork my Super-Linter example, and then you're going to implement this one file in all your others. So hopefully that makes sense. And tell me put this in the comments. Like if you've done this, come back to this repo, throw it in the comments, or go to our Discord chat and talk about it. How does it work for you? What problems are you having? Do you have ideas for this example? Would you recommend I change something on it? I'd love to hear feedback because I just created this today. This is less than 24 hours old. So, all right. So thank you all to their asking questions. I haven't been listening to chat or reading chat. Let me catch up. Okay, thank you so much for the compliments, Rajot. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. I was looking for linters and formatted for Jenkins files. I believe that's in there. Is it not in there? Let's go look in the Super-Linter. Let me zoom out. Okay, so there's no Jenkins mentioned. I was just looking here. There's no Jenkins mentioned in the Super-Linter. So that's the benefit and the problem of open source. So what I recommend is if you have, I don't know if it's a Jenkins file editor or linter, sorry. So I'm not a huge Jenkins person anymore because I feel like I just don't like it anymore. So in all my projects and with my customers, I'm always trying to move them off Jenkins to something else. Circle CI, GitHub Actions is my new favorite. Drone if you have to. So what people do is they make a PR to add a new linter, or they at least add an issue that says, please add this linter. If they don't know how to make a PR, they'll just add something in here, right? So if you look at all these, these are all about people updating linters, adding new linters. I just don't know if there's a Jenkins file one. I don't know if anyone knows of one. If there's a pipeline file, linter, stuff like that. I don't know the answer to that, but if there is one, we should definitely add it to Super-Linter. The weird thing, though, is Super-Linter's project is focused on GitHub Actions, and in GitHub Actions, you probably wouldn't be linting Jenkins. But I definitely work on projects today where they do some things in GitHub Actions and other things in Jenkins or in Drone. So that also can be normal for large projects where you have maybe a really complex testing infrastructure that you'd use Jenkins for. And for the easier, simpler stuff, you might use public GitHub Action runners. That might be a good example of doing that. So I think it's totally worth putting in an issue. In fact, let's just search. Does anyone mention Jenkins? Can it be used in Jenkins pipeline? So that's not the same thing, but it's but yeah, it's essentially what I was saying. Like if you want to run this in Jenkins, you just use a Docker run command like they give you an example of. If you want to oh yeah, this person's like, I want to run it in a Jenkins file. So yeah, I don't know about Jenkins editor or Jenkins linters, but many languages now come with a default formatter for the language. Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Conrad. Thank you for that information. Yeah, and that's the thing is like if you're in VS Code, you're already getting some linting out of the box, especially if it's an infrastructure as code, because a lot of those tools, and like YAML and JSON, there are public definitions for a lot of those things that it automatically tries to adhere to. So as you're writing, you'll get little yellow squigglies that tell you about this stuff. And it's kind of like inline linting, even though they don't call it that. So great comments. Thank you. Yeah, and then there could be a groovy one. Great point, Oliver. Oops, too many O's. I'm just searching for it. Yeah, well, npm groovy lint. I don't know. Lint format and auto fix your groovy Jenkins file, Grado files using the command line. Okay, so maybe this is in there. Plot twist. Maybe this particular one, I don't know why it's called npm groovy lint. Maybe it's just because you're getting it through npm. So it says Jenkins files, Jenkins pipeline, circle C. Yeah. So there's your linter. Awesome. Great idea to look up the groovy keyword. So yeah, so then if we go back to the README, so you can see here that we've got the groovy linter, and then if I search for groovy again, validate groovy, so you can turn that on and off. It doesn't have, I don't see a groovy, custom groovy file, but if you go up to the templates directory, I bet you'd find something. Let's see if we can find groovy. Yep, groovy lint RC right there. So that's the template for the customization that you might use for that. And what they do here is in these templates, they will use the template that's existing out of the box. So one thing you might experience, this is kind of a pro tip, is if you run a particular linter manually locally, and then you just run Super-Linter and you see different results, that could be because of these templates. Because out of the box, these Super-Linter templates are not empty usually. So there's something in there, and that may not be what you're using for your local linting. So one of the things for your project, and I'll probably need to put this in the README, one of the things for the project of you implementing Super-Linter is that if you have existing linting config files, let's say you have an ESLint, .ESLint or something like that, that's already in your repo. The way you implement that in Super-Linter is step one, assuming you're using GitHub Actions, you would put it in the linters subdirectory. You'd move it. You technically are going to move it into the linter subdirectory here as the proper name as Super-Linter expects it to be. It's usually the default for whatever that linter's standard is. You put it there. Then what I recommend is you symlink it back to the root of the repo so that your local running of linting works. Because if you're used to maybe your code editor or just the command you're running, or maybe you've got some make files that automatically run linting for you locally, that stuff probably expects the file to be in its default location, not here, right? So you need it in both locations. So either keep it in the root and symlink it to here, or vice versa. But that's what I do with teams that already have a bunch of linting files in the root. I end up moving them all here, symlinking them back to their original location. Sometimes it's a different file name, but so I'll symlink it to a different file name. That way I don't disrupt their workflow locally while also enabling GitHub Actions to Super-Lint. So that's going to be a step for you. All right. Perith, sorry if I mispronounced that. If someone's developing in private repo, dealing with sensitive code, do they have to concern themselves with security about using Super-Linter or Dependabot? No. I'm not aware of anything sensitive about linting or Dependabot. Remember, things are happening on your code in GitHub, whether you know it or not. A lot of the security stuff is already enabled in your repo. I bet you if you went to one of your repos now and you went to the security tab, you might have some of these things already enabled, which means there's bots running against your code, all the time. So if you're focused on security, so first off, private repos work great all day long. My first use of Super-Linter was in private repos. So I use them in private repos all day long. Works great. It works great with GitHub public runners and GitHub private runners that you run yourself. It just works. It's a very simple little Docker, Docker image that just needs to bind mount your code in and run a bunch of commands against it. So it's not changing any code. And the way you can ensure that you're running least privilege, as I recommend you do, is in this example. Oops, I'm in the wrong repo. In my example over here, I set the permissions up so that that basically Super-Linter only has read access to the code, not write access. and it only has access to write to the status API. So that's the only thing it has write access to. So the way that that works is that when you're using it, and let's say I don't have a pull request, but let's go to my code, right? See that little X there? That X is known as checks, GitHub checks. And GitHub checks run many things, as well as GitHub Actions, against commits or PRs or both. And you've probably seen these all over the place. But you can see here that I'm running Trivy and I'm linting. And those are so I can see the details here. And this is when we were talking about that it fails because it needs an update, basically. So if you click on these things, you get more information. And I can go here. This takes me to a security scan because I do a security scan of the image here in this repo. You may not realize this, but when you go back on your commits, you can see this stuff for every single commit, right? And you can click on it, and it'll show you all the actions that have all run on your code, as well as any GitHub apps or any integrations you have. So if you've integrated your Jenkins pipelines, for example, with your GitHub commits using the webhooks method, those will show up here as well. And they show up for every commit and every PR, depending on how you've set them up. And so, for example, on this one of the nice things about Super-Linter is that as it detects different file types that have changed, it dynamically makes a new line, a new check. And that's how it uses the status API to keep adding checks. So based on what you're changing in that commit, it runs, and you're going to get more details here. So in this one, I must have changed, like this one looks like I added, it's building and pushing a Docker image, and it looks like it was running the copy and paste protection linter, which I disabled eventually. So that's not going to run anymore. But you can see different ones probably for different commits as I change things. Like up here, I had disabled things, so there's less running. And you'll see this in my other repos as well. So if I go to GitHub, let's just go to one of my other repos just to show an example. And so that's known as checks. And the status and checks APIs are kind of one of the same. So let's go for this one. So if I go to my commits, if I scroll back far enough, you'll see how these don't have any checks. It's because this is before I ever had, I didn't have any automation back then, so I didn't have actions happening. But as you scroll, you can see for each commit, different stuff happens. Based on, this one only has one check. So most people don't realize that stuff's there, but it keeps a history. It actually even keeps the logs of all of those runs by default for 90 days. And that's how you can get to it. Even after your PR is merged and the PR branch has been deleted, you can still get to those logs by just going back in your commits and looking for all those runs. So hopefully you learned something. And that was not a dumb question. That was a fantastic question, so thank you. Supports for Jenkins files. Yeah, we just found out. Look for the Groovy. The Groovy extension, or the Groovy linter evidently does Jenkins files. So you want to get into open source projects. This is the perfect time for you to do that. While that is not a topic for this specific live show, I'm glad to help. And that is because Oktoberfest. What's it called? Codefest? I forgot about the Codefest. And it's with a K. Hacktoberfest. That's what it is. Hacktoberfest. All right, I'm going to give this to you. This is your chance. And you get street cred. Street cred. Thanks, Anton. Yeah, Hacktoberfest. I forgot about it. this is, I mean, this is actually a perfect time. I should have made an announcement about this because it starts, you can actually start now, but it's technically starts in October, but they're already kicking off. This is designed, this whole program is designed to get people into open source. And what you're going to see is, assuming that the guidelines and the event hasn't changed, what you're going to start finding, excuse me, I was drinking tea and I got a tea leaf in my tea. All right. All right. I'm going to give them my data, just my email address. And then it's going to ask me for my email address. I just did this. Okay. And then choose an email address. Choose my location. I am not an event organizer, but I am a maintainer and a participant. So one of the things that's going to happen here is that people start marking issues or problems or needs they have in all their open source with a special tag. And I'm going to opt into DigitalOcean. I've read and understand the rules, even though I haven't. If you try to hack the system, by the way, and make bad PRs or fake PRs, there will be problems. You will not get the prizes, or and you will not get the T-shirt or whatever the prizes are this year. So they make you sort of agree to that because people, in the past, they've been giving out thousands of T-shirts, of which I've been a lucky recipient of one, and there's people, of course, that just want the T-shirt. They don't want to do the work. So they will auto make a bunch of garbage PRs, and that's created problems in the past. So they've worked really hard to get to do that. So one of the things, let's see. Yeah, I don't see, usually they have like a thing where it says, go look for, and I even had this on my own repos. So if I go, let me see if I can find one as an example real quick. You can search for public, and someone if chat, if they remember how this works in previous years. So it's not going to be in one of those. It's going to be in like my, I'm going to try to open up that one and maybe this one. So in issues, see how there's this help wanted? Help wanted means this might be a good thing for you to try. I'm not, maybe I got rid of them in the past, but there is a label. I can't find it. And I think it's called like Hacktoberfest is the label of these issues. I seem to have removed it, but in the past, that's what they've done. I'm not sure if they're doing that this year, but it was a way for you to find any repo open source with stuff that people were specifically saying would be great for either a first-time committer or someone who's wanting to do that. Remember that this isn't always about code as well. Like you can get involved and improve documentation, and improve READMEs, and add GitHub Actions to some of these repos to do Super-Linting. Maybe you could do that. I mean, I think it's only, is it 5 PRs? That was something like, there was a minimum for one of the years. I think it was like 5 PRs. You could add Super-Linter to 5 public repos of stuff that's a part of the project, and you could get your prize. So anyway, check that out for getting started in open source this whole month. This whole thing is all about getting started. So it's the perfect time for you. Thanks for asking the question. All right. I'm going to wrap it up because I feel like we've done a ton and it's been an hour and a half here. So I hope you find this valuable. I will be updating those repos with more Super-Linter example stuff and more details in the README as time goes on. So the way to get updates on that is to join my Patreon, because over here at patreon.com/Bret Fisher, For free, you can just click the follow button. And then when I make major updates to these things, I send out little notifications to people. All right. Thanks again for joining. I will be here next week. We have upcoming guests in the next month. We are going to have, I think it's next week, Victor Farsik, who's going to be on the show, Docker Captain. He is going to be here to talk about DevOps automation and probably more specifically on deployment automation. So we're going to be talking about that. And then later in October, we're going to have Datree on to talk about their product, Datree. And then in November, we're going to have Mattermost on, which is a Slack-like developer-focused chat system that's open source. And we're going to be talking about that and how to use it in Kubernetes and stuff like that. So stay tuned, and you can learn about all those things on my Patreon. We'll announce when those people are getting ready to show up on the show. So thank you, everyone. And I'll see you next week. Ciao.